coming to Organizing Workers and Non-Workers. We have a really fabulous panel here for you today. I'm going to briefly introduce everyone. My name is Gregory. I am a lecturer in digital sociology at the University of Edinburgh. Really pleased to be here. Been doing a lot of work on digital labor and digital sociology, and it's really excellent to see the conversations continue to evolve. Today we have 5 people joining us. And so the conversation is going to kind of move quickly. We will hold all of the questions till the end. We should have about 30 minutes, hopefully maybe for question and answer. So just take good notes. Joining us today is Stephen Hill. Here. Stephen is a senior fellow with the New American Foundation and a Holbriggs Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He's the author of 5 books, including the recently published Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. Title. An internationally praised Europe's Promise: Why the European Way is the Best Hope in an Insecure Age, which was selected as one of the top 15 books in 2010. Also on the panel is Susie Cagle, who is a 2015-2016 John S. Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford, where she researches labor shifts, their social and economic impacts, and sustainable cooperative models to support freelance workers in media and other industries. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Susie's great work, as she's a technology columnist and cartoonist at Pacific Standard and Al Jazeera America, and a frequent contributor to everything, to The Guardian, to Forbes, Beyond, and others. She's great. We also have Criscitiello, yes, to the director, who is a lead research analyst at the SEIUW and SEIU UHW in Oakland, California, a union of 80,000 healthcare workers. She is also a union-side labor attorney. She is building an innovative employment model that collectivizes the employment status of unionized workers on scale. In the new worker-driven democratic landscape, her model allows for on-demand labor without compromising traditional union values. And finally, second to last. Astra Taylor is joining us. She's sort of sitting in the darkness over there. She is a filmmaker, writer, and activist. Her films include Zizek, a documentary about the world's most outrageous philosopher, and Examined Life, a series of excursions with contemporary thinkers including Slavoj Žižek, Louis Miller, Cornel West, Peter Singer, and others. Taylor's writing has appeared in The Nation, the London Review of Books, Book Forum, and elsewhere, and she is the editor of An Examined Life, a companion to the film. She's also co-editor of Occupy, Scenes from Occupied America, and as you probably all know, Taylor helped launch the Occupy offshoot Strike Debt and is a Rolling Jubilee campaign. She is most recently author of the book The People's Platform: Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. And finally, we also have Kati Sipp, who is the state director of the Pennsylvania Working Families. She is also editor of the blog Hack the Union, which is great and you should follow, which focuses on the intersections of work, organizing, and technology. Prior to her work here, she spent 9 years working at the SEIU, Healthcare Pennsylvania, serving as the statewide political director and spending 5 years as an executive vice president of the local. Kati began working with the SEIU in California in 1997, where she was an internal organizer, working with classified school employees. She left California in 1999 to move back to the East Coast and began to work for the Philadelphia Unemployment Project, where she organized mothers who were affected by changes in the state's welfare policy. So thank you all for being here, and without any further ado, I'll hand over to Steve.
Okay, do we need these mics because it's being recorded, or if I speak loud? Okay. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in Manhattan. I'm coming here from San Francisco. This is my second tech conference in the last 3 days, another one in San Francisco, and it's sort of, I'm thinking of doing an anthropology of tech conferences, the type of people that come to the different tech conferences. The one I was at for the last couple of days had the CEOs of Microsoft, GE, Kickstarter, I can't even remember them all, and there's a lot in those sorts of conferences. There's a lot of happy talk from the techno-sapiens about how everything is going to be groovy. You're going to love it, and I'm going to make $1 billion at the same time. Nothing wrong with that. So it's good to be here, where there's a little bit more questioning of the dominant techno paradigm and thinking outside the box. You know, when I researched my book Raw Deal, and I come at it from a journalist, I'm not a tech specialist, or even, you know, I can operate my things barely, but can plug them in, keep them juiced. But the thing that became apparent was that wait, let me make sure I get my time going here so I don't overrun. That, you know, you can talk about the gig economy and the sharing economy and all the peer-to-peer economy, the on-demand economy. It's got so many names that it's just dizzying. But that you really have to see it in terms of a spectrum of what's happening to the labor force in the United States. And there's a lot of, I'm impressed with my fellow panelists. There's a lot of people here that know a lot about labor, so hopefully we're not going to overlap. But this was what really struck me. You know, if you look at the situation of a TaskRabbit or someone who's driving for Uber, in many ways, the conditions they're operating under are not all that different from a part-time worker who's working for, say, Instacart, who says, well, if you get above 30 hours per week, you get safety net, health benefits, and what have you. And so most of their workers just don't ever get above 30 hours a week. You know, they use those thresholds as a way to prevent workers from getting what they need. But even beyond that, for a lot of part-time workers, they're being subjected to what's now called as just-in-time scheduling, where they can use algorithms and such to really pinpoint when they need workers, and oftentimes you don't really know what your schedule is from week to week. Sometimes you don't even know it a few days in advance. You show up to work, they tell you to go home because it turns out they don't need you that day. And so you're really almost on call, just like you are as a gig worker, as a, you know, working for TaskRabbit or what have you. And so, and none of these workers, for very few of them, do they have much of a safety net, if any. No job security, the wages are low, and increasingly this is being sort of handed to us as, you know, how we're going to all access work in the future is through this app-driven technology. And there's just a number of things wrong with it, besides not having a safety net and, you know, not having very high wage, and you don't know where your next job is coming from. You're always looking for your next job. I mean, for most people, if you have a job and you work 9 to 5, you show up at your job and you're paid for every minute from 9 to 5. You're paid if you go to a meeting with your coworkers. You're paid if you're just standing around the water cooler with your fellow workers. You know, sometimes that's where the best creative ideas come from, is standing around the water cooler. You're paid for that. With the gig economy, you're not paid for any of that anymore. The only time you're paid is when you produce that report or produce that logo that you've been contracted to make, or whatever product you're producing. You know, I sometimes say it's as if, like, use a football metaphor, if Tom Brady, the quarterback, he only got paid for when he throws a touchdown pass. And all the other plays and all the other training that goes into that moment, you don't get paid for. It's on your own time and dime. That's a radical reconceptualization of work and what we think of as work. And, you know, they're selling it to us as, well, it's going to be more flexible. You can work when you want. You're going to be the CEO of your own business. But you know what? Most CEOs that were at the conference that I was at yesterday, they're making tens of millions of dollars a year. So maybe they don't, you know, the flexibility seems pretty groovy. But when you're only making, you know, some of these Uber drivers saying they're not even making minimum wage. Yesterday at the conference, they had David Plouffe, the chief flack for Uber now. He used to be Obama's campaign manager in 2008. Now he's flacking for Uber. He's on stage saying the usual Uber stuff, and an Uber driver comes to the microphone and tells him, look, I'm trying to make this work full time. I'm barely making minimum wage. We have a ton of expenses that do not get reimbursed by Uber. You know, the things you're saying are just not true. And when I tried to complain with Uber, they cut me off the platform. You know, so, you know, I went to the panel earlier about ratings and such things, and, you know, do these ratings allow these companies to self-regulate? That's what, you know, a lot of the people are saying. In fact, there was a speaker here yesterday, I believe, a professor from New York University, Arun Sundararajan. You know, he and I have done events together, and we very much disagree on these things because, to his way of thinking, self-rating. The rating system is enough for self-regulation for these companies. Well, let me tell you something. For Airbnb, you know, this is a great example of something that started out as a pretty good idea. You know, the idea that you could rent out a spare room of your home, make some extra money when the economy is not good. What could be wrong with that? Well, now Airbnb has drifted very far from its origins. It's basically become a platform that is a loophole for professional real estate operatives to get around the local laws that have been established in most cities for decades. You know, most cities had a law that said you can't rent your place out for fewer than 30 days. The reason why was they didn't want the local housing stock that is needed for local people to be turned into a football that could be rented to tourists instead. And some of that has always gone on, right? You know, Craigslist and what have you. So when it was going on at a certain low level, it was fine. But Airbnb and that technology and the app technology has ripped open such a loophole that allows these sorts of landlords to, you know, in San Francisco, I've interviewed tons of tenants who have been evicted from their building, the entire building cleared of tenants, seniors, disabled people, don't know how to fight back, even using the laws that exist to protect them. And they're evicting them and turning them all into Airbnb hotels. It's happening in building after building. And these are the professionals that are doing it. And here's the thing, Airbnb knows it's happening. They try to plead ignorance, they try to say we don't know, but look, they've got their data more than Tom Slee. Tom, you here? Tom is like the man. He's done the analysis of Airbnb showing what their platform is becoming. Airbnb has the data. They know there are landlords here in New York City with over 200 hosts. I mean, hosts with over 200 properties. I'm sorry, that is not a, quote, regular person host as Airbnb likes to portray. Okay, in San Francisco, we just had a ballot measure, Proposition F, that was voted down by the voters. Airbnb spent $10 million to defeat that. I've been following politics for a long time in San Francisco. It's the most money I've ever seen a corporation spend to defeat something. This is the sharing economy. This is the crumbs economy. That's what it's become. And so, you know, a rating system can't fix that. A rating system can't fix that. I mean, it might be useful for you if you're trying to rent out on Airbnb to have some sense of what that particular host is doing, but that's not the problem. The problem is that, as I said, these companies have figured out a way to use these technologies to rip open a hole in labor laws, in local residential housing laws, all these sorts of things. In fact, they're proud of it. They say we disrupt. That's what we do. And the people's lives who are being disrupted are not very appreciative. I mean, and so here's in some ways the real dilemma, and I think almost the real danger of what the types of technology that's being pioneered. Because in some ways the gig economy, sharing economy is really still fairly small. But they're pioneering a technology that can be used. It makes it so much easier to hire and fire. So, you know, let's say I'm an employer and you're an employer and you're an employer. And I use this technology to get rid of all of my regularly employed workers and to hire all contractors using this technology. You know what happens? As a result, my labor costs go down by 30% because I'm not paying for health care, Social Security, Medicare, injured workers compensation, unemployment compensation, paid sick leave, paid vacation, none of that. So my labor costs go down. What's going to happen to your business if you don't do the same thing? And in your business if you don't do the same thing? It's going to put this downward pressure, and it's already happening. It's been happening in the economy already, but this technology is going to make it worse. I'll give you an example. Pharmaceutical company Merck. They had a plant in Philadelphia. They sold the plant to another company. Company lays off all 400 workers, hires back all 400 workers as independent contractors, gets out of all those labor costs, and proceeds to make the same drugs for Merck that Merck was making for itself. This is the type of danger that we are drifting towards in terms of what's happening to our economy. So we really have to, I think, you know, much harder about what's happening here instead of just simply like, well, I talked to my Uber driver and he seemed to like it quite a lot, you know? I get that all the time. I get that all the time. And here's the thing. Next time you talk to your Uber driver and he tells you that, you ask him, how long has he been driving? Because the clear pattern I've seen in all the Uber drivers I've talked to, in Lyft and Sidecar and all of them, is that the longer you've been driving for Airbnb and the more hours you drive it per week, the less you like it. And that's telling, isn't it? I mean, you know, Travis Kalanick at one time was saying, my full-time drivers make $100,000 per year. And I mean, it doesn't even pass the laugh test. And he challenged journalists to go talk to my drivers. You'll see. So some of them did. They asked for their pay stubs. Turned out they were barely making what taxi cab drivers make. Some of them aren't making minimum wage once you deduct their costs. And then they released a report. You know, it shows you sort of how these companies operate. And this is not that different from what a lot of corporations do, right? But just, you know, keep in mind, this is the sharing economy. they released a report. It was called the Kruger Report because a co-author was Alan Kruger, a Princeton economist, who's really, quite renowned. And of course, the first flaw with the report is that it depended all on Uber data. And I sometimes say you can rely on Uber's data about as much as you can rely on China and Greece's data. They're just in the business of releasing what they want to release in order for us to get what they want us to know. But the second problem with that report was that they actually said, well, you'll make anywhere from $17 to $30 per hour. $30 in New York, 17 in Washington D.C., 22 in San Francisco. Well, if you start doing the math, the number of hours you'd have to work to get to $100,000 a year works out to be like 9-10 hour days, 365 days a year. So oops, that one myth of Travis Kalanick went down the drain. But the second thing that was wrong with it is that that report didn't take into account drivers' expenses, which are considerable. Think about it. If you're using your own car, wear and tear, gas, insurance, all sorts of things, your expenses are going to be considerable. The third problem with that report was that they collected the data in October of 2014. They released it in January of 2015 in time for the Conference of Mayors, trying to impress all these mayors. And 2 weeks after the conference, they cut the drivers' wages in 48 cities by 40%. This is a persistent pattern. That's why I say you got to ask the driver, how long have you been driving for Uber? Because after they've gone through a couple of these wage cuts, they're not too happy anymore. And they cut them in two ways. One, they reduce the amount of the amount you get per mile, and then secondly, they increase the amount that Uber takes from each fare. When Uber first started, they were taking 5% of each fare. They're now up to 25, 30%, depending on the city and the service. So, they're squeezing drivers in two directions, and drivers are reacting in rather interesting ways. Drivers are starting to figure out that the only time they make money is through surge pricing. Everybody here heard of surge pricing? When the price goes up 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 times when there's not enough drivers on the road. We've seen horror stories of during disasters here, Hurricane Sandy, the price of an Uber went way up, and as a result, Attorney General Schneiderman went after them for price gouging. But beyond the crises like that, when the price goes through the roof, what the drivers are doing is they're, like in San Diego, on a Saturday night, about 50 or 60 of them all show up at a Pizza Hut. They log in, so it looks like they're on the platform. Then they log off. They all sit around for a couple of hours having pizza and beer until there's not enough drivers. And then when the surge happens, then they all log in and they go out to drive. So they're basically trying to, 2 minutes left? Okay. They're basically trying, for understandable reason, manipulating the price that all you as consumers are going to pay. So there's just many things, problems like this that are going on in the sharing economy, gig economy, the part-time W-2 economy, and really what it comes down to is, part of my book, I have a whole bunch on what we should do about these sorts of things. So I'm going to lay out one of them really quickly, and we can fill it out in Q&A if that's of interest. The big challenge now is, as I said, it used to be you go to work, you get your, most people had a single employer, they worked for that employer for many years. That's where they got their safety net and their good job and their security and their, they got a salary, they got training. That's what's going away. Now more and more people work for multiple employers. And so the question is, how are we going to provide a safety net for people working for multiple employers? Our system was never set up for that. So here's what myself and a few other people are proposing. That we would create for every worker, whether you're a contractor, a freelancer, a temp worker, or a regularly employed W-2 worker, an individual security account. And every business that hires you, no matter what your relationship to that business, even if you're a contractor, even if you're an Uber driver, that business would pay into this individual security account a certain amount of money prorated to the number of hours you work for that business. And then the money that goes into that individual security account would be used to purchase your safety net. It'll go into things like Medicare, Social Security, injured worker, unemployment. So if you get injured on the job, you're not completely shut out like so it's happening to so many Uber drivers. By doing this, not only would we give you a safety net, but we would get rid of a big part of the incentive that employers have now to hire you as a contractor because they get out of that 30% of labor costs. And you remove that incentive, then it's basically creating legal parity between all these different classifications of workers. So I think that this is the way that the economy is going to have to go, some version of this. And this is not that different from what is already being done in Europe and Canada and Australia. You know, having workers who, regardless of the classification you're in, you have some degree of safety net, job security, you know, decent wage and these sorts of things. So thank you for your time.
So awkward. I'll hold it like this.
Yeah.
Oh, that's all right. That seems even more awkward. So I've covered technology and labor and the emergent gig on-demand economy, whatever you want to call it, the new service economy, over the last few years. But a big part of what drew me to that was that I'm also a freelancer. I really identified with that kind of work, and freelance journalism doesn't really incite the same kind of moral panic that I think that we feel about this emergent gig economy. It's existed for a long time, and a lot of people have been doing it that way. They've been making a living, but it's changing. So I've been a freelance journalist for 8 out of the 9 years that I've been a journalist. And for most of that time, I've made less than minimum wage. And for most of that time, I've tried to get jobs at news organizations that would ostensibly give me stability and allow me to spend less time pitching and invoicing news organizations and more time doing actual reporting and writing. But fewer of those jobs actually exist. The 2 times I have been employed at news organizations, I spent almost all of my time aggregating the news that other people reported, posting anywhere from 5 to 15 posts every day. So as a freelancer, I was able to do that reporting myself for a third to a half of what I made as an aggregator. And I often saw my original reporting end up regurgitated on those same sites. I came really close to quitting journalism many times, but the closest time was in 2011 when I was covering Occupy in Oakland. I was arrested while reporting because as a freelancer I was not eligible for an officially recognized police city press pass, and my employed colleagues openly made fun of me. They thought I was a joke, and I had trouble selling stories because legacy media organizations didn't really give a shit about Occupy or about Oakland, except when they did, and then they would fly their own staffers into town who would then ask me to help them for free. Because freelance journalist still has this connotation of hobbyist or unemployed, or secretly rich, which is often true. During that time, actually, a report from the Neiman Lab came out about America's new news deserts, places where news organizations had died or shrunk to the point of uselessness, and Oakland was one of them. I found myself actually allying more and more with the unpaid citizen journalists that I met in the streets than with the paid professionals. I launched a WePay, and I raised more than $7,000 in a month to keep reporting. It was far more than I was paid in total from all of the very fancy news organizations that I was ostensibly working for. At the time, I really thought that might be sustainable, that people like me and amateur live streamers could cobble together crowdfunding enough to do this as a living, and that our collective passion might keep us afloat otherwise, our affinities. But it was just too hard. None of the citizen journalists that I met then are still working at this. None of them. It's unrealistic to think that volunteers will be able to serve as our community watchdogs in their supposed free time, especially when they need to spend that free time driving for Uber because they don't make enough money to live. There is just less material support for journalism, and as that happens, only the more and more privileged people are able to do journalism, and we can make some guesses as to what kind of stories they're going to want to tell. We're already seeing that happen. While I was doing that coverage, I was offered 2 full-time reporting jobs, which would have had me aggregating other people's reporting in an office all day for only a few more dollars every day than I was making working on my own. So that experience really shaped how I think about independent journalism now. The case for incumbent news organizations is often that they're the only ones with the means to take on large, corrupt institutions, governments, and corporations. They're the only ones that know how to file very, very complicated FOIA requests, and they're the only ones with money and inclination enough to send reporters to dangerous conflict zones and to boring, long city council meetings. Journalists lament the disruption of the news business model endlessly. The uncoupling of ads from news that prompted papers to consolidate and cut costs and lay off reporters. But they don't see how they've been completely complicit in this shift. That those cuts weren't made in the interest of keeping journalism alive, but in extracting profits from what is still a massive profitable industry. New nonprofit news organizations have emerged in recent years with some success, but they're still largely organized like this old model. It hasn't really changed. And both of these kinds of news organizations are shifting much of the costs of their product onto freelancers like me and my colleagues, while benefiting from the trust and loyalty that we have built independently with our own audiences. The new wave of unionization in digital newsrooms, from The Guardian to Salon, is awesome. I don't mean to undercut them. I think it's great. They're suffering in the content mines, and I get it, but that organizing doesn't benefit the freelancers who are contributing much of the content that those organizations end up profiting from. Freelancers who could easily be used as scabs to undermine those unions. But organizing independent workers is hard, especially independent journalists. I did my first freelance journalist survey last fall, asking people what they would want from a freelance journalist union or solidarity network. What can we do here? And most people said that they just wanted resources to help them find a full-time job. So when we talk about saving journalism in journalism circles, in these ridiculous media conferences that I go to a lot, it's really a euphemism for how do we save the New York Times. That's all that anybody means. And there's this presumption that if we fix this broken business model and undo the destruction that Craigslist and Google and Facebook wrought upon our beloved fourth estate, if we save the New York Times, those benefits will trickle down, and legacy news companies will hire back all those staffers, and they'll pay their freelancers decently again. I hear this from media pundits all the time. They tell me this to my face. They're full of shit. I think we know better. But organizing independent workers who actually want to be independent, who actually do like being freelancers, who see a benefit in that, is really, really hard. Freelance journalists are very individualistic. We're competitive by nature and by necessity. Without an institution to lean on for loyalty and trust with your readers, you have to build your own. It's hard. It takes a long time. I know the idea of a personal brand is very fraught, and that's an important conversation that we can have about who gets to build a personal brand and in what way they can and in what other platforms and tools they have to use to do it. But in this context, it's really important and valuable. My brand is my integrity. It's why people trust my work, and it's why they pay me for it. It's the biggest benefit of being an independent journalist. It's a part of what a media company is paying me for when they contract me to do work for them, and it's what would make me a very not good employee for that media company. It's also what a lot of new intermediary freelancer platforms are trying to exploit, which is super scary and disgusting. So these are a few of them. Contently launched a couple of years ago with the stated goal to save freelance journalism. Contently representatives approached individual journalists with good reputations and audiences and asked us to join their platform, create a portfolio on their site, and they told us they would help us find work. But that work isn't journalism, it's writing advertising content for brands. Contently promotes the fact that it has thousands of reputable journalists on its platform, but I've talked to a lot of those journalists who actually don't know that that's what Contently does. They were completely duped into joining this platform. And last year, Contently won Columbia Journalism School's Innovation Award. Beacon Reader launched early last year also to save freelance journalists. It's basically a journalism branded Kickstarter. Like Contently, the reps approached individual journalists. I was approached by both Contently and Beacon Reader, and they asked us to join. When I asked them why and what they had to offer, they couldn't tell me. Since then, Beacon's done a lot of work to partner with large media organizations and essentially subsidize otherwise underpaid freelancers with crowdfunding for organizations that could otherwise totally pay their workers appropriately. You might have seen last year they hosted a campaign with the Huffington Post to raise $40,000 to hire a journalist to cover Ferguson for a year. So the poor Huffington Post, and they recently renewed that campaign. So they're doing it again. A fellow from my program at Stanford last year created a freelancer database for the Washington Post so that editors could ostensibly be able to find us elusive independent journalists. And after it launched this summer, someone working for Contently wrote about how it seemed like the dawn of an era of proprietary freelancer databases as a new media business model. And shortly thereafter, the creator of that network quit the Post, and now she works in strategic communications at Facebook. Word Rates and Pitch Lab launched very recently, like a couple weeks ago, also to save freelance journalists. Part of the project is aimed at creating a database of media pay rates, which is actually work that others have been working on for years for free. If you're not familiar with who pays writers, and this is of interest to you, it's a great project that was first launched by Modula Martin. It's just a list of reports from writers about how much they were paid for particular jobs, and the conditions of that work, if they bought all of the rights, how long it actually took to get that money. Modula and I are working right now to improve it, make it more searchable and user-friendly. And a few weeks ago, the creator of Word Rates emailed us to ask us to shut it down and volunteer for his project, which is also an agency that would ostensibly represent freelancers to editors and take a cut of their rates. When I suggested that we might collaborate on something free and open and equitable, something with the central goal of creating wage transparency in the industry and not taking those wages for ourselves, he was not interested. So none of these platforms are really growing the market for journalism, and they're certainly not changing the market. Wage transparency is incredibly important in terms of revealing bad actors and giving freelancers the data they need to better negotiate and advocate for themselves with bosses. Of course, the biggest and most profitable organizations are not the ones necessarily paying the best. I was just checking the latest rates on who pays, and one of them is for Refinery 29. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Well, they pay $1,000 for a reprint of an article that someone had already written. Meanwhile, The Atlantic paid $100 for a piece of original reportage the same week. I don't think that transparency alone will serve to pressure journalism organizations to actually pay freelancers better. I think it might, but I do think it might show readers who care about journalism just how poorly paid their favorite journalists are, and that could provide a different kind of positive pressure. It might also make you think twice about this piece that seems really great if you know that someone was only paid 1 cent a word to write it. And you might think a little bit deeper about where they might have gotten the resources to write that and why they did it. The dominant presumption in the industry is that readers want everything for free. I don't think that's true. I think you have to make it easy for people to pay you, and you have to provide them with something worth paying for, and that's something that news organizations have largely failed at. Podcasting is in kind of a unique position to do this because it has some of that established NPR membership culture. I think one of the most exciting projects in the space right now is Radiotopia, which is a collective of individual podcasts. They just ran a very successful membership campaign. They got 15,000 subscribers and donors to sign up, giving recurring payments. But at the same time, they're still mostly relying on advertising revenue. It's still the same old game. I personally have no advertising revenue, but I do have subscribers and donors who give to me individually. It's just very, very hard for me to get their money. A culture of not paying for journalism is reinforced by the fact that we don't have good available tools to do it. Crowdfunding tools like Patreon force creators like me to post our work on platforms that we don't own or control. I bring my audience there and lend the legitimacy of my brand and my work to boost theirs, but I can't choose what my work looks like or how it's delivered because Patreon doesn't really want to be a tool, it wants to be a platform, and it wants to eventually tack ads onto my work that I won't get money for, and they still want to charge me 15%. So maybe the blockchain will fix this. I hear that all the time. Bitcoin, micropayments, it sounds great. Doesn't exist. Let me know when it does. I'm looking forward to it. But I am still optimistic about the survival of independent journalism and the potential for cooperative models to solve some of our most difficult problems, which are really libel insurance to protect us from litigious story subjects, negotiating for government press passes, and forming reporter-specific co-working spaces with resources we actually need, like LexisNexis, not 3D printers. I think these groups actually have to be organized not as big tents, but as trusted affinity groups that might work in solidarity with one another. And it is happening now, slowly. Ultimately, I think that stuff can scale. I can't scale. I don't want to scale. Ultimately, I am pro co-op, and I am very, very anti-platform.
Okay. Well, what I want to share is what I've been learning and some challenges with a brand new union worker co-op that we're building in Oakland. We're building it with a tech partner, which is, I think, why it's appropriate to talk here. But I'm sort of a traditional union person. So we're creating a worker cooperative with members of our union, and we're sort of helping them and advising them. But it's theirs, not ours. And it's a co-op of LVNs, licensed vocational nurses. So in California, LVNs have been kind of squeezed. LVNs in California are mostly women, mostly immigrant. So they're having a very hard time getting jobs at hospitals, which is traditionally where LVNs work. And partly because RNs in California have been really successful at expanding their own scope of practice and practicing to the edges of it, and LVNs have sort of shrunken. So anyway, that's the group of people, and their own scope of practice is actually pretty wide. They can give vaccinations, do wound care. They can do most sort of like low to mid-ish acuity level stuff that somebody might go to an ER for, but doesn't really need to go to an ER for. So yesterday, people were talking about trust, which kind of resonated with me because this is forcing a lot of very dissimilar people, dissimilarly motivated, and different kinds of stakeholders to come together, and which I think is a great thing, but it definitely does involve a lot of trust, and it does feel somewhat like dealing with the devil, to be honest. And I'm guessing our tech startup counterpart feels that way also, and I mean, on the labor side, by definition, we sort of resent authority. So there's just like very cultural, deep differences. But so that's just like broadly the biggest challenge so far that we're working through. And something else that came up yesterday was a controversy or discussion about what are unions doing? Are they doing anything? Are they doing nothing? In the face of, this tide of increasingly insecure and under-benefited workers. And actually, I think my friend from the AFL stood up and made the fine point that unions are and have been doing that for decades. And what unions are doing right now, to me, feels no different. Unions have imagined and reimagined themselves in ways that feel identical to what's happening now. Unsurprisingly, unions are expert and deeply experienced at waging collective power, and that's at its heart what this is about. And so just to draw out the kind of two paths that I think are happening that have happened before, and they're good paths that I think we're going down now. One is the industrial model of organizing, and so this is totally appropriate in the cooperative or even platform cooperative world. And it looks at workers' rights and protections, how they're diminishing, and how that, benefits like workers' comp, health insurance, things that were normally contingent on an employer's relationship to an employee now no longer exist, and on scale in an industry, how would we replace that? And the other path, which is clearly the framework for where we're coming from given the scale, is more of a pre-industrial guild model, where you monopolize a labor supply in a particular market, and you force other people to come to you by owning your own labor. And so you start small and you can scale it, which is the appeal, because this is quite daunting. So for what we're doing, for example, were it to be as successful as we would hope, you could add other job classifications. If LVNs thought it was, it would make sense to add rad techs or whoever else, it could be scaled. So in terms of back to the trust piece, the co-op is not just about sharing ownership and sharing governance and profit. It's about the LVNs controlling their own labor, and so that has driven up sharply against the need to raise capital up front. So our tech counterpart is they'll talk to venture capital people. This is like way outside of anything I have any experience with, and unsurprisingly, they have deeply different motivations for optimizing and drawing out, cashing out immediately, which is just totally antithetical to the idea of building something internal and investing in itself to keep building. So we're figuring that out. That remains to be seen. We're trying to negotiate an MOU, help barter basically an MOU between the unionized worker co-op and the tech startup. And so that equity sharing piece ideally would be neither can profit without the other, so any successes should be borne by both. So there should be this reciprocal ownership and equity piece crossing both ways. So we're working on that. Let's see. Another challenge, not as deep but kind of interesting, is how unions can actually logistically be involved in creating cooperatives, since there's an obvious conflict issue, since unions can't be employers. And so the way we've dealt with that, which has been okay so far, I think, is to as the board has formed and the bylaws written and the articles written and filed with the Secretary of State, and it's sort of become more real, the union has stepped back and become, just like any other stakeholder, more of an advisory kind of role. And we remain in the bylaws, as do other kind of like community seats, as a non-voting advisory single, there's a single person on the board from the union constituency that has that advisory non-voting role, which is great. And so the union's role has been valued from the co-op's perspective, in part because the union brings these really long relationships with employers to whom we can make a solid business case that you should use the co-op for your labor. And so in this case, we believe we can reduce ER admissions and improve clinical outcomes. We can provide healthcare consumers with a cost-effective way of receiving care. And we believe that the model can materially reduce healthcare costs in California if this were really scaled. And many of the gains will come by centralizing employee benefits and simplifying key labor functions, which are both, I think, unique. I don't know. They're things that unions can uniquely bear, I think, to the situation. Contracting out has an interesting role here because we've seen employers take really drastic measures to increase staffing flexibility, which is common among all kinds of employers. And while outsourcing of departments like dietary and housekeeping in healthcare is really common, we're now seeing employers contract out core hospital functions to staffing agencies, like respiratory therapy is a common one. And we believe that employers want to focus on the core hospital business and are looking to limit non-core functions, but there's not really a solution. So this co-op model solves that problem, at least somewhat. And it's not like contracting out is actually cost effective in this particular world, because labor costs to hospital employers for core functions like this are 50 to 100%. It makes zero sense, other than flexibility, probably, and a feeling that you get to move people around when you want to. So the co-op has an enormous advantage of sharing the gains directly with workers, and having a more, a happier, healthier, more robust workforce, which does have returns to the employer. And this is also just sort of interesting because we're looking at this world where we're talking about the same workers and the same employers. Like, we're not changing the structure or the platform or whatever. We're not it's the same. It's just the relationship is going to be different when workers say we're not negotiating for power, we're taking it, and we're not different from our labor, we own our labor. That's like the game changer. Let's see. It does feel dishonest to not talk about, to talk about these new labor models and incubating co-ops and all this kind of stuff, without mentioning that it's obvious that unions have a key goal of surviving and increasing union membership in whatever form that might be, and it's hard to argue that unions are not dying, like numbers are going down, but there's a transformation that's happening that has nothing to do with surviving or dying. It's transforming, I think, which is actually really exciting. And in terms of how union, in this particular example, how the union can wage its own, kind of collective power in some world to help the constituents of the union or of the cooperative, when the union is bargaining with the co-op, the union has enormous purchasing power. So the union can leverage purchasing power for any benefit that you could imagine, on behalf of any scale of co-op workers. So let's see. I think the last thing I would mention is just that it is refreshing, I think, to see a different kind of labor relations. It feels old school, but not in a great way, like the us versus them, really traditionally adversarial kind of labor relations. And this just opens up a whole new world where, so it involves trust and this feeling of dealing with the devil. If we can get through that, I think it's very promising.
Red light.
What? Oh, sit in the tall chair? No, here.
Do you want to just switch?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to use this nice little microphone platform. Okay. I am here. My name is Astra Taylor. Glad to be here. I've been to all 3 of Trevor's conferences, and I always get a lot out of them. So I am here as the representative of a small team working on a project called the Debt Collective. I have a collaborator in the house, so if I forget anything, let me know. This is a project. The seeds were sown during Occupy Wall Street. And one thing I'm so grateful to Occupy for was that it brought me into contact with people like Susie and so many others. It introduced me to this whole community of people to collaborate with who were also thinking about economic issues. And I vividly remember the early days of Occupy, like maybe the 3rd or 4th day, and this guy young man with this butcher block paper, and he was yelling out in this carnival barker kind of voice, "Step right up and write down what you're worth to the 1%. And at the time, I had $45,000 in student loans, and I remember just this kind of catch in my throat and being like, oh my God, I hate facing that number. It's thanks to the new school, by the way. How many people have debt from the new school in this room? I know there's more. Come on, there's got to be more than that. All right. And the numbers that people were writing down were just remarkable. I remember really being struck by this one young woman who looked to be about 20 years old, writing down $120,000, and people were writing down $50,000 of medical debt. It was just this moment where I'd been so outraged about my student loans. It was just this sort of moment of, at least, not even, there's no collective power, but it was like collective catharsis. We were writing it down. And debt, of course, was what brought a lot of people to the park. It was, of course, the mortgage crisis, student debt, all these issues. It seemed to be this common thread that was uniting people, and that was part of the motivation that brought people out in force. I ended up joining a group. We started gathering around the name, gathering under the name Strike Debt, and we launched something called the Rolling Jubilee Campaign. This is our first project. Thanks. And the Rolling Jubilee Campaign is still going. It's kind of amazing. We launched with the ambition of raising $50,000. We had a sort of postmodern live stream telethon. And what we wanted to do is raise $50,000 because we knew we could buy and erase $1 million worth of medical debt on the secondary debt market, because certain types of debts are bought and sold for pennies on the dollar, to debt brokers and to debt collectors who then try to extract the full amount. So we wanted to make a statement about this industry, these sort of merchants of misery, but also to say, we think these debts are odious and illegitimate, and that nobody should have to be in debt because they want to go to school or because they get cancer, right? That debts taken out to secure the basic necessities of life are really immoral. And the campaign went kind of crazy, and we ended up crowdfunding $700,000, committing that we would do this project totally for free, not paying ourselves, self-exploitation. And so we've erased now $30 million worth of healthcare medical debt, and there's actually some amazing, very surprising to me stuff in the works that will hopefully be happening in the spring with that project. But the idea was we never thought that we could buy and erase all of the odious debt sloshing around the American economy. So there's always this sort of parallel idea that what we need to do is tackle the problem at its root, and we need to get debtors to organize and come together and challenge creditors and demand other ways of financing these basic necessities, right? And to push back on the extreme inequality that's undermining our democracy. This was totally theoretical. It was yeah, it's a great idea. We were like, people probably aren't ready. I don't know. People will never really want to strike. It's very risky. But we did a ton of nerding out because we're a pretty nerdy group, it's fair to say. We nerded a lot. We wrote pamphlets and papers, and we read about finance, and we read about bankruptcy laws, and we read about, obscure legal provisions and this and that, and, understood the issue, but we still thought, this is an analysis. But it's a sort of long, it's a bit of a complicated story, but we came upon a portfolio of debt from a collapsing for-profit college chain called Corinthian Colleges. So we all know, University of Phoenix, right? There are these sort of McDonald's type schools that this school served 110,000 students at its peak, right? Nationwide, and sort of commuter campuses and online. And it was systematically fleecing these students. It was lying to them about job placement rates. It would count a graduate as being employed in the field of accounting if they had had a job at Taco Bell before they enrolled, because the cash register. So you're talking about students who have tens and tens of thousands of dollars of debt for worthless degrees, often debts that they didn't agree to. Anyway, they were being investigated by state and federal authorities, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau just won a lawsuit against them, or not a lawsuit, they were just accused of predatory lending. Anyway, these schools are very, very bad actors. And so we don't think the students who attended this school should be on the hook for their debts. And so in February of this year, 15 of them went on, with our help organizing them, went on a debt strike. And it was the first ever student debt strike that we know of. Very modest, but the thing totally exploded. And soon hundreds of people were on strike, and we could have had thousands, except there were sort of capacity issues in terms of onboarding them to the strike. garnered headlines, endorsements from representatives and attorneys general and the New York Times and unions and all sorts of things. And eventually in June, we actually forced the Department of Education to announce an unprecedented plan for debt relief for defrauded students. So we proved that organizing debtors, that debtors exercising collective power works. Thanks. Now, have they enacted that promise perfectly? No. They are doing the bureaucratic runaround. But we are continuing to put pressure on them, and we are expanding the strike. And actually right now it'd be fun to show that little clip. Yeah. There's a 1-minute clip. Does anyone watch The Good Wife on television?
Yeah, it's awesome.
I thought it was that show about the Mormons with lots of wives, but it turns out it's about lawyers. And anyway, the debt strike was the theme of this show, and it's kind of humorous. Oh. Oh yeah, it needs sound. Let's see. Can we bring a microphone to it? That would be like. Oh, no. Oh, I think this might work. Yeah.
Wait, I'm not sure if we have the wherewithal. Actually, a class action isn't possible here. Enrollment agreement you signed. When you registered at Coliseum, you signed a document saying you wouldn't sue the school. Signed a 100 pieces of paper. Did you really sign away our rights? Unfortunately, yeah, legally, yeah. Okay, so the school can screw all of us and then trick us into not doing anything about it?
Class action suit isn't possible. Wait, that's truncated. Corinthian College.
Yeah, the guy figured
That
it
was
out.
very weird to see.
Coliseum graduates who are ready to default collectively and suffer the consequences unless you intervene with the Department of Education and the loan companies to settle their debts.
Really? Getting desperate already.
It's a debt strike. Let's see how that will play with your visa. Or you can settle. We're listening.
Thank you. So the dramatization gets some stuff wrong. It's these self-interested lawyers who are looking to scale up, and we were like, man, we're like these unpaid volunteers. But what they get right is that it is going to spread. I mean, we are now looking at taking on the whole for-profit sector, and the goal is to create networks of debtors, collectives, right, that are capable of large-scale mobilization and collective bargaining. And making demands, exercising their collective power. And the theory is basically that debt is a form of power for the indebted, that it's a form of leverage. If the 1% has wealth, then the 99% has debt. If students have collectively, or if Americans have collectively $1.3 trillion of student loan debt, that's $1.3 trillion of leverage. If 1 million people are defaulting every year on their student loans, which they are, it's 1 million people who could be working together and making demands instead of sort of drowning individually, ashamed and isolated. And that's why our slogan from the beginning has been, "You are not alone," as in ALOAN. So how does this tie into this thing here, right? And basically it's because the analysis is that in this moment, whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, financialization, or euphemistic or optimistically, sometimes people say late capitalism. We know certain things, right? We know that the welfare state's being gutted, that we're kind of moving from a welfare state to a debt-fare state where we're all individually debt financing things that should be provided freely to everyone. So we have to individually finance our pensions and our educations and our healthcare and all of this. We know that wages are going down, and that this has been sort of masked, that there's been this illusion of prosperity because there's been this easy access to credit, right? And why are wages going down? Well, a lot of it is because the trade union movement is in decline. And the problem is that even if unions were suddenly to spring to life, which I really hope that I hope they do, a lot of people are not in workplaces right now where they would even be in unions. So there are all of these people who are not being looped into the cause of economic justice, and they can be, but they can be through debt, right? So a gig worker at Uber, or our freelance journalist selves, or musicians and artists, or students, or people who are unemployed, or people who are between jobs, whatever. Many of them have debt. This debt sticks to them no matter where they go. It sticks to them through time. And it's something that people can unite around. And this was, again, purely theoretical not that long ago, but we have seen this. We have seen debt become something that kind of helps create this new identity that crosses a lot of boundaries. The group we're working with on the strike is a very diverse group of people. They are low income because that's who these predatory for-profit colleges tend to target. So I think, on that level, that's the analysis, and I think it has a lot of potential because it's something that's very complementary to the labor movement, right? It doesn't compete with traditional labor, but we are building essentially a sort of 21st century debtors union. There are challenges because debt might stick to people, but the people are still dispersed. They don't share a factory floor, so we can't go to the factory and organize them. So we've had to be very creative in terms of reaching out to them. And we've sort of run the gamut of finding people online. A lot of the people are on Facebook. The challenge then is to get them off there into their places. But, people are also at the campuses of these schools. People are in their communities. We're beginning to organize regional hubs. We will now have regional hubs across the country. So it is a kind of hybrid of finding people online, but also connecting with them face to face. So there are challenges with this model, but I think it is an important one to experiment. So it complements labor, it complements a lot of racial justice organizing because we know that it dovetails, we know that predatory lending disproportionately, I even hate the term disproportionately impacts people of color because it's actually much more violent than that. When you look at Wells Fargo targeting people in Baltimore for ghetto loans and targeting what they called the mortgage brokers called mud people, right? This is all in the New York Times, the very reputable New York Times. There's something, the sort of white middle class was built on access to credit, and other people did not have access to that credit and actually were given, these terrible predatory loans that they, when they qualified for something much different. So I think there's all sorts of ways that this type of organizing can collaborate with other struggles that are happening. The Debt Collective, I think we aspire to build a multifaceted organization. I think we're building it. It's in its infancy. And again, we'll be scaling the strike through the spring, and we'll also be doing a lot of nifty stuff with the Rolling Jubilee. But a multifaceted organization, I mean something that's part think tank, so staying true to our nerdy side, doing a lot of research, analysis, understanding the issues, understanding structures of finance, understanding law. Being a think tank, but something that is also tied to media making and spectacle. I come from a filmmaking background. At a certain point, I just thought, I do not want to just be behind the camera. I want to do real organizing. What I've learned is that so much of organizing involves using the media, using cultural channels to your advantage. So I think there's a kind of spectacle component, doing dramatic things like the Rolling Jubilee, like the strike, that really grab people's attention. And then a third component of this organization is just, collective action, direct action, whether that's traditional civil disobedience or new forms of economic disobedience, because that's what we need to make change. It's incredibly important that we go after the financial sector right now. Their profits are what's driving a lot of inequalities, not the robots eating our jobs. And this is, one way to possibly go at it. Thank you.
pretty relevant to my life, is that I actually was professionally trained as a stage manager. I went to a college called Mason Grove School of the Arts at Rutgers University. And I, just last night actually, because I was in New York, ended up going to a birthday party for somebody that was in grad school that when I was an undergrad who, and a lot of folks who I haven't seen in like 25 years happened to be there. And, you know, I really believe that my theatrical training helped me be more a better story-based organizer, and so I sort of revamped my presentation this morning, so hopefully it's going to make some sense. But it's going to start with talking about a really dear friend of mine who I've known for 25 years, who's a guy named Dave Moretz. Dave is an actor. He was a graduate student when I was an undergraduate stage manager, and you know, we talk about the gig economy sometimes like it's this like fancy new thing that happens only on platforms, and that, you know, Uber drivers are like the vanguard of the gig economy. But the reality is that many artists, and performing artists in particular, have lived in the gig economy for centuries, right? Like Dave has, you know, for most of his life, made a living as a working actor, but he has also had to do other jobs on the side. He's been a caterer. He does this crazy thing where he like goes and enacts depositions at law school. So he's like the person that gets asked a bunch of questions. He does a lot of voice acting. He narrates books for Audible, but he cobbles together an income from a bunch of different streams. And that's not really that different from what we're talking about when we talk about the kinds of work that Steve in particular is talking about in his new book. And part of the way that Dave's been able to be successful in his life, to the extent that he is successful, is that, you know, he can have a catering manager like him and, you know, think, yeah, you know, Dave might not always be available at the time that I need to hire somebody, but I know that when he works hard, and he's like a good bartender or whatever. And you know, that he has a reputation that is really, you know, allows him to like continue to have on and off employment relationships with people who are in need of on and off workers. And I should back up for a second and talk a little bit about reputation. You know, the quote that the title for this talk comes from is actually from the play Othello. Cassio talks about his reputation after he is the subject of a frame job by Iago. And what he says is when he feels like he's lost his reputation because Iago attacked him, is that he has lost the part of him that's immortal. And the only thing that's left of him is the beast. And I think that, you know, for a lot of us, we don't really think about our work reputations that often. We think about, you know, kind of live in the world and you go to work every day and, you know, sometimes you do a good job and sometimes you have a tough day, but you're not like thinking about your reputation so much. But for some people who are working in the gig, for people who work in the gig economy, it's certainly a factor. And one of the big, in my opinion, like problems with the platform, you know, economy or the on-demand economy is the fact that workers substantially do not have any control over their reputation, and in many cases, their reputation can be used against them and not really doesn't get used to reward them. The way that, you know, some of us who have good work reputations get financial rewards for that. You get asked to give talks at conferences. Sometimes you get paid to write articles. You know, you get to do stuff that helps you earn more money. If you don't have any control over your own work reputation, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to reap the rewards of having a good work reputation. So when it comes, yesterday in his opening statement, Trevor made this sort of comparison from gig economy workers or platform-based workers to domestic workers. And one of the things he talked about was how both of those kinds of workers can be invisible or can seem invisible. And I think that there is, that actually really resonated with me because for many years I worked with home care workers and their allies in the disability rights community who have a sort of slogan, which is invisible no more, right? People want to be invisible. They don't want to be invisible. They want to be seen. Both folks with disabilities who require home care and the home care workers who help them get out of bed every day and take them to, you know, go to the grocery store to make sure that they have food in their house for the week and do all of those kinds of things. They want their work to be recognized. And I think that, you know, one of the things that we forget about is that it isn't just the workers who become invisible in the platform. It's also things like how their workers are rated. That is to some degree not that visible. right? Like you might think, oh, I, tap this star on my Uber driver, but you're not thinking necessarily about the long-term consequences of that rating to that driver. Or your Airbnb post, somebody that I work with just posted a picture today. He had an Airbnb tenant who like broke something in his house. And I was like, I guess you're giving that person not a very good rating. Seems like that's not ideal. But for folks who are relying on those kinds of platforms to earn a substantial part, if not all of their income, that the sort of algorithm and what happens with your one rating really is going to matter in ways that aren't going to be mostly transparent to the user. Most of us in this room, when we think about our jobs, how many people in this job or in this room have a resume or a CV, if you're not from the US? Almost everyone, right? The rest of the folks who don't have one, are you a student? Raise your hand if you didn't raise your hand, or are you just not looking for work, maybe? All right. So, we also have things like coworkers that we can rely on for references, and sometimes also those folks are networks for us if we want to find a new job. We rely on the help of other people to tell us about work in places where we haven't heard about it happening. I personally, know of. I've gotten jobs before where there wasn't an ad that was placed in the newspaper. There's a lot of work in the the not on-demand economy that happens through word of mouth, and that's not always fair. And I think that one of the things that the platform economy can actually help us do is to make the sort of where is work available more transparent, and that's can be better for some people. Word of mouth isn't necessarily good for women, if that's the main way that a company is recruiting people to work for them. It isn't necessarily good for people who didn't go to the right colleges and have a network of people who went to that college. It isn't necessarily good for people of color who, might be victims of unintended bias from the folks who are doing the hiring. So having the ability to have things other than word of mouth be ways that people get work is, fundamentally at its base, I think, could be transformative and more democratic, and transparency in that way can be, helpful. But we also know that one of the things that's happened in the gig economy or the on-demand economy is that workers have been the victims of unintended bias by users, right? There are lots of stories of people who have, picked up somebody and that person had, was drunk, and the Uber driver said, I don't want to take you in my car because it might cause, there might be some instance as you might puke in my car or whatever. I don't know what their worries are, but and then the drunk person rates them badly. Now that drunk person, when they were sober, might be like, well, yeah, that was actually the right thing for you to do, but they in that moment aren't necessarily thinking clearly. They also might, rate women who aren't smiling differently than they rate, men who aren't smiling when they pick them up. I actually have talked to a reporter recently where, I was like, look, one of the things that's happening in some ways in the gig economy is that the kinds of emotional labor that women have historically been expected to perform now, to some degree, is actually it has to be done by everybody in the gig economy. It's not just, taxi drivers didn't get terrible ratings if they were grunting at you, but you will give your Uber driver a bad rating if your Uber driver is grunting at you because you have this ability to do it. You didn't have the ability to do it with your taxi driver before, and now we have that. So, because of the lack of transparency in the way that the actual algorithms work, how many people know in the room what's the rating an Uber driver has to stay above in order to keep on the platform? 4.6. So that could mean you have a Uber driver who's only driven 3 times, and you give that person a 3, you might be knocking them off the platform, right? You would have no way of knowing that as the person who's riding in the car. But that's basically a one strike and you're out policy for a worker. And as somebody who did work in the traditional labor movement for many, many years, that's the kind of discipline that is really only reserved for the absolute worst things that people do in most jobs. You get fired for stealing. You get fired for violence in the workplace. I mean, but for most most of us, you make one mistake, you don't lose your job as a result of it. And so one of the things that I think that we have to think about as we're building platforms is, what are the unintended consequences of using algorithmic rating systems to rate workers? So going back to my friend Dave, Dave is lucky in that he is a union member, and he's a member of the union SAG-AFTRA. And SAG is, SAG-AFTRA is like part of the solution to the insecurity that comes with his gig lifestyle, because every employer that he has that is an acting related employer pays into the health and welfare fund of the union, or they pay into the pension fund of the union. So he isn't having his, sort of safety net completely put onto him. The employers are picking it up. Now, his catering employers are not like paying into the SAG-AFTRA health and welfare, so he does still need to make sure that he has enough acting work in order to stay in the program from year to year. Stephen talks a little bit in his work about the building trades, who also, the building trades unions also have similar situations where, they have collaborations with multiple employers. If you're a union carpenter, you don't necessarily work for the same carpentry company every time. You go to work on a building, and that building has a contract, has contractors, and those contractors have a contract with the union, but they all have the same contract. It's not like, 10 different carpentry contractors have 10 different wage rates in the same market. Similarly, SAG-AFTRA has, they have one like commercial contract in the city of New York. So if you're making a voiceover contract in the city of New York, you're in the same pay scale as everybody else who's making a voiceover radio commercial in the city of New York. So you can have, through sort of it is possible and exists in the world already, the ability to have sort of industry standards in terms of wages, pension benefit contributions, and other kinds of things like paid time off or sick leave and stuff like that through multi-employer opportunities. So I want to switch a little bit and talk about how is this relevant for folks who are thinking about building platforms. And I would like to propose some things involving some principles for reputation when it comes to online work platforms. One is, they should be worker-owned. I don't think I'm going to get a lot of controversy from this crowd about that. They should be transparent, right? People should have an understanding of what they're being rated on and how's that rating going to be used. They should be repairable. You should be able to say, I made a mistake, I helped fix this mistake, and now I can get my reputation back. Just like you can in real life, right? Just like you can in any other job. They have to have, be multi-employer ones. We can't have a situation where if you're an Uber driver, you get that 5-star rating or that 4.9 rating, and you decide, I don't want to work for Uber anymore, I'm going to go drive for Lyft, and now you're starting from scratch. You don't have any of that reputation coming with you, and that seems like not the way the world works. When I left my job 2 years ago, I took my work reputation with me. People still knew who I was. It wasn't like I was wiped off the face of the earth just for not working there anymore. They need to have algorithms that fight against user bias. So you should be able to see, does this user constantly rate African American women lower than they rate Asian men? We should be able to figure that out and be able to fight against it. They should be rewarded. If you have a great reputation on a work platform, that should actually be worth something. And I'm not saying necessarily it has to be worth cash in your paycheck, but it has to be worth something. That's why people try to get better at stuff, so that they can get rewards for things. There shouldn't be any sort of one strike and you're out kind of policy, right? You're just starting at a new job. On your first day at a new job, you're not expected to know every single thing that you're supposed to do. So you should be able to learn from your mistakes and move forward, unless there's really some incredibly egregious behavior that's illegal or criminal or something like that going on. And then finally, I believe it should have some kind of grievance process, so where you could actually, as the inventory isn't getting reversed. So Dave's union got kind of formed the old-fashioned way through a merger. No, it's a union joke. But in 1929, actors struck Hollywood and got and created the Screen. I mean, it was called still Actors Equity then, but they created what is today the Screen Actors Guild. And in 1939, they struck radio producers and formed Astra, and those two unions have recently merged. But those unions have evolved over the years, right? Like, you think about the kinds of technology that was being used in Hollywood in 1929, and the kinds of work conditions that were created by the way that people made movies in 1929. That's not the way that you would write a contract. That's not the work conditions that you would write a SAG contract for today. They are evolving, and that's important. But they're also trying to figure out like how to organize workers in new markets, right? I don't know if folks have seen Will Wheaton's recent piece about the organizing of workers who do voiceovers in video games, but that is, actors, that is a job that actors do, and they get paid for it, and they should get paid, they should have a sort of way to, have that reimbursed the same way that you get reimbursed for like multiple screenings of The Good Wife, although I'm assuming we're not paying for that particular show. And they're also trying to figure out, how to deal with other kinds of channels. So, so I want to point that one of the things that I just want to point out in closing is that this kind of thing is already happening, and we're sort of, to some degree, because we're not talking about it, we're letting it happen in the private sector. We've got, most of us in this room probably are on LinkedIn, which is a place where, you talk about your work history and people rate you. People write you recommendations and things like that. There's also Work Hands, which is a similar platform that's explicitly for people who work in the construction trades. This company said, hey, we don't think that guys who are like union plumbers are going to be on LinkedIn too often, but we do think that they need a platform of their own. There's Karma, which is a site that is aggregating online reputation from sources like eBay and Etsy. So it's like, you're a person who sells stuff online for a living. How does your reputation cross over on platforms? And then obviously there's things like MakerBase that are just not so much about rating systems, but really are thinking about how do people know who worked on an online project and making sure that people are getting credit for the work that they're doing. So I think that it's really important for us to sort of take a lesson as we think about the fact that these things are happening and that we're all creating platforms for people to get work, that we have to build platforms that are evolutionary and will continue to grow and evolve as the industries that we are all working in change. But that we also can't forget about the fact that we need workers to be able to own part of doing online work is being able to own your own reputation and being able to say, yes, I was here and I did good work in the world. So, thank you. Thank you all. That's really wonderful. Just going to ask a question. Do you guys want to ask any questions of each other before we open it up to? No? Shall we take? Can we take questions from the audience? Questions? Start here and go back.
Thank you very much for the presentation. They were great. I just want to point to the experience about the debt and just say that in Barcelona, well, in Spain, actually what happened is that we have a situation in which there is many people who has debt because of the mortgage of the houses. And this has been like a very fraudulent kind of activity from banks on doing that. And the people start who have this situation. And in Spain, if you have a mortgage, you can and you cannot pay it, you lose the house, but you still have to pay the mortgage. And so the people start getting organized and coming together. And at the beginning, it was a lot of psychological work of don't feel ashamed, and also helping to each other. They organized in a way that they were able to stop at least 1,000 evictions by collaboration between each other when they were going to evict you. And actually the person who drives and helps the organization of this process, that is called La Paz, now is the mayor of the Barcelona City Council. So I am trying to point about the powerful dimension about organizing the people who is affected more by the crisis and affected more by the injustice. So perhaps someone involved in the debt economy is going to be the mayor of New York City.
And I just want to emphasize, the law was more punishing there. It was actually worse, you know. And I think there's this thing of, but we really are so inspired by that example, and I nominate my friend over there to be mayor.
Okay. I'm gonna try to go like gender parity here, so think
Yeah. So yeah, just kind of follow up on this debt thing. I don't know a lot about the law, but I know a ton about being over $100,000 in debt. So I was wondering, what are the risks of going on a strike every student?
Yes. There are risks associated with it. So that's why we want people to do it collectively, strategically, and to be informed of the consequences and to actually be in a situation where we feel like they could win. I mean, striking is always a risk, whether you're striking on the job. So it really depends on your situation. I mean, the risk of just defaulting on your own, again, 1 million people are doing that every year, are that they can add up to 20% to your principal. And this, I learned the hard way when I defaulted on my student loans, because I got a call and they said, oh, you actually owe us $10,000 more than you did yesterday. And I just thought, like, that doesn't make sense. But it does, it makes sense. And the government has a lot of, you know, most student loans are federally secured. They can garnish your Social Security and your disability and your wages. And this is, you know, the power of the finance industry is what they rewrote the bankruptcy laws, right? And that is why we need to organize to undo some of that damage and create a different system. So yeah, there are lots of risks. But you know, for the Corinthian students, there was almost nothing. There was almost no risk, and we can talk about why maybe one-on-one. But we definitely think it's something we need to have on the table as an option, but really the thing we need to do is smartly and strategically as possible. And that those people, the 1 million people who are defaulting on loans, we should actually politicize that and get them to have a sort of shared identity instead of sort of being in the shadows. And at one point we were playing with the name the Invisible Army of Defaulters.
So, points with the reputation follow you. One of the big things that happens to people of color in the workplace is they get pushed out by bad performance reviews. And since racism is systemic, what happens if someone doesn't want their reputation to follow them because they have racist, 3 stars, okay? So, and then the second thing is with student debt, it seems like both what a lot of the media and the government is focusing on is the for-profit universities, but there's a lot going on at very reputable universities that are run by hedge funds in terms of bloating tuition and student debt. And why is there not more focus on that? And can we see a future of people striking who are from these reputable universities?
Yes, it's going to happen, and then I'll be mayor. No. Yes, we need to. There are lots of reasons that we started with for-profit colleges. One, the evidence is that the people who are poorest are being charged the most, right? You wind up, you go to university, you have more debt than if you went to Harvard. So there's an idea, I mean, especially there's an idea that debt is this like middle class white kid problem, and they got poetry degrees, and now they've got $200,000 because they studied, sculpture or something. So, this is one sort of stereotype we keep encountering. So I think it's also important to actually, this is like everything. This is actually disproportionately affects the people who are already at the bottom, puts them further behind. I think the statistic is that this, it's 2020 is going to be $2 trillion in debt. It's going to extract $20 trillion, mostly from poor families and individuals, right? So it's a wealth loss. But yes, and there's lots of sources of common cause. Loan servicers, different financial entities that are involved in both, whether you're a student at a for-profit college or a traditional college. I mean, we're making a very technical argument these students were defrauded, but I think you can actually say, you know, if we're premising the idea that you go to school to get a return on investment on your degree and the kids can't get jobs, we've kind of all been sold a bill of goods, right? I mean, the whole purpose of education is being corrupted, but people aren't getting what they paid for. And that's the same for fancy schools. The hedge fund question is interesting. I mean, how I understand it is that many universities have their endowments, have parts of their endowments invested in hedge funds. I actually have a story coming out in the next couple of months about that fact and the idea that actually there should be a divestment campaign against hedge funds, just like there is one against fossil fuels. That's actually a sort of target the students, current students, and the one I could organize around for lots of good reasons, because the hedge fund managers then go on and lobby for the privatization of education and for charter schools and for low minimum wage and to bust unions and all this stuff. So I think that's actually a pretty fruitful target, you know, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say in answer to your question, my very first principle is that it has to be worker owned and not, so that you can either fix your reputation or decide, this isn't fair and I'm not gonna have it follow me forward. I have a really good friend who I was writing a piece about this and I was talking to him about it and he was like, yeah, I was a really shitty hotel, you know, housekeeper when I was in college and I wouldn't want that like reputation following me. It's not what he does, you know, he's not a hotel housekeeper now, it doesn't apply to his, you know, sometimes you do a job poorly when you don't like it too, right? Like, I think we've all been there. So, yeah, having the ability for workers to actually own their own reputation, I think is so important and very critical.
Yeah, so these binding arbitration clauses, which came up in the video that we were watching, but the history there is that John Roberts was representing Discover Card, and then he eventually became the head of the Supreme Court, and took a case that made it so that they could put these into contracts and the states couldn't do a damn thing about it. Anyway, this is credit cards, this is private universities. Lots of debt depends on being able to extract this wealth and ensure that classes can't be formed. I guess I'm interested in why you think it's not a good idea to maybe push for the removal of the federal law that this decision is based on, rather like as opposed to the path that you've taken, which is to ask for forgiveness of debts. To try to reinstate the rights.
So get rid of the arbitration.
Right, because you could just remove the federal law. And
How do you do that?
Irrelevant.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, you start not paying debt and courses, such as they are.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, the CFPB is actually working on binding arbitration and financial contracts, specifically within student debt and credit cards. And Americans with Financial Reform, which Alexis former, she's
Alexis is on it. More questions?
Two sort of relatively granular questions. One for Ray. I may have just missed it, but I wanted to hear more about what the tech side is, like what their interest is in this sort of like co-project on the co-op, and what they're doing and what they're sort of contributing and how that's working. And the other question was for Susan. You mentioned sort of organizing around affinity groups or things like that in terms of journalists. I actually helped run a independent academic institute, and we sort of do similar things but sort of formalize it. And I was wondering why the co-op model or a less terrible, like a Patreon or whatever, like platform model might not be available for sort of small groups of journalists to get together using that. I mean, that's not quite a journal, but something like caption, a journal or magazine.
So I think it's on. Yeah. So the tech folks, it's two people. We didn't seek them out, and the co-op folks didn't seek them out. We sort of like ran into each other in these weird circles that happen in Oakland, and they're. I mean, it's a woman in particular who's been very successful and has philosophically is really in the same place that we are in terms of like worker rights and you know, I think she called herself a Marxist. Like she's definitely not like sort of anyway, so they, I mean, I think their interest is not in making money. It's in seeing in helping, grow something really different. So they're poised to be really wonderful partners. They have relationships and access and affluency in a world that is really different from ours.
But they're not like building something for something.
They are.
But they are.
They are. Yeah, they're also like I think she's a genius or something. They're like technically. Yeah. Yeah, they have. I'm still catching up, but like wireframes, or I don't know. They've like built. They'll come and they'll show like this is what it would look like, and we're all like, holy shit.
Okay.
How did you do that? Yeah, no, they're building it.
Building a database of workers.
No, the actual like on-demand
object,
dispatch thing that you. So the technology that would tell somebody that. So if you contracted with a hospital system for a certain number of LVNs, or let's say an employer would, as a for their workers, would give 1,000 vaccinations to their workers who live in hard to get to areas or something. They're building the technology that lets somebody request the LVN to show up, know where to go, all this stuff, the rating stuff, all of that. Yeah.
Just the logistics of starting a small company like that. I mean, I have lots of friends who've started lovely little small magazines and then they've died.
Yeah.
That's really hard. No, I mean, the magazines have died. That was vague. Their souls have died. I mean, it's also just a matter of like, who I might want in my affinity group. We don't all cover the same beats. We don't do it in the same way. What if we're all reporters, but I like to do shorter things, and maybe those just don't belong in the same place as my friend who does long investigations on sex work. Like that's just it's the logistics of that are weird. It's a nice idea. I've been in a lot of situations over the last few years of let's start a small news organization, and it just gets mired. So.
Okay, do we have time for like 2 more questions? I have a question as well for Susie. I'm a freelance filmmaker and a video journalist, and it was interesting when you mentioned that now that 6 media outlets unionized, there's this interesting question like what is the relationship between now the unionized staff and freelancers, and whether freelancers are going to be used as scabs. And so the question is do you have any ideas how to turn that positive event into something that could benefit all workers? And do you think that unions could have an incentive in raising the wages of freelance workers and how they could serve as allies?
Absolutely. At first I was much more optimistic about those organizing efforts because I saw the Writers Guild is behind that, and the Writers Guild should be representing people like me, but they don't. And it doesn't really make any sense. We have the same interests in mind. There are and I try to have a conversation about this with some people I know at Salon, especially a Salon that pays $200 for long pieces of deep reporting, which is just outrageous. But at the same time, they have all these staffers, and those staffers they didn't want to have that conversation. It's a difficult conversation. They know that they're benefiting from the low wage work of freelancers. What I think they don't realize is that it is completely in their best interest for freelancers to be paid well, because if they have some sort of conflict with their boss, it's much easier for their boss to go out and hire a bunch of $200 a piece freelancers that are driving all that traffic to that website. So I mean, everybody should be on the same page on this. I hope that happens. Some of the places like The Guardian and Al Jazeera America, which had more difficulty unionizing, at least in my experience, I freelance for both of them. I do it regularly. They treat me well and they pay me fairly. But when I see places like the Huffington Post talking about unionizing, I just have to laugh. It's crazy.
Do you think that the shaming campaigns would be a viable strategy? Because it looks like who pays writers is a part of that is that transparency.
transparency, but used to shame those.
I mean, I do a lot of personal shaming. I mean, that's if you follow me on Twitter, that's kind of it is. And you know, it's gotten me some checks overnighted to me by some bad editors. It works. My first shaming campaign was McSweeney's, which screwed me out of a bunch of money. They screwed a lot of people out of money, but they're so beloved and cute. I do that personally. I think that you know, and that's Word Rates has really been aggressive about saying they want to have ratings for editors. I talked to editors about how they might feel about that. That's very complicated. I don't know that I really want to go down that road. I think that who pays is really more about transparency. We actually N+1 did an article. This was last year that was about who pays and about their sense that we were shaming, especially small news organizations, small magazines that could only pay $50, $100, and that's not really what we want to do. That's certainly not. I can speak for myself, not Modula, but that's not. I don't want to do that for places like N+1. Small magazines that really don't have that money, that aren't making big profits, that don't have shareholders that are demanding that, that kind of money. I think that that's fine. What we want to do is, shame the bosses that are exploiting people for their own profit. But I do think that we need to be careful about doing that because I still want to have a lot of editors as friends, and I want them to see writers as allies, and I want us to together create a better ecosystem that works for everybody. I think if we all just start screaming at each other, it's not going to work.
One thing real quick about that, because in your experience, some of these editors themselves are under a lot of pressure and not getting paid that very much.
Yes.
The amount of turnover I've noticed among editors, you develop a relationship with an editor, they like your work, you can go back to them with new things, and then suddenly next time you go back and they've moved on to the business channel, or you know what I mean, whatever it is, and so it's all down the chain really.
Yeah.
That people aren't being paid well, they're under pressure, and it's just the gig.
And they often don't have control over their budgets. There's some person above them who's
Right.
telling them, you can't negotiate, you can't
Right.
pay more than this.
Right. So where does it start? Who's it? Who's pulling the string?
How are you doing? Thank you. I know I'm in the right room and knew it 2 minutes after I walked in. Somebody invited me to come to this because I'm working on a project, and I certainly understand what it's about. I think I have the solution that isn't worker owned, but it does allow for explanation of certain things, that allows people to have their reputation. It's not about, you have the right to be forgotten. Don't join. If you want to be, this is about the right to be remembered, about to have your personal integrity, about to get paid, and to facilitate the interactions between work and people, which there's a ton of work that people don't have people to do it just because they don't have the right connections and they don't have any track record. So think of it like as a Craigslist. If you had Craigslist and there was an escrow thing where if I want to hire you to do something, I can put $500 in escrow and we have agreements, and when this gets done and this gets done, you get the money gets paid out. So it's sort of like taking a big picture, looking at the problem from the side of getting more money to the people, to the workers, and the loans will take care of themselves. And that's a separate issue of the unspeakable nature of all that is not what I'm concerned about. But I think it's really about putting opportunity in front of people, letting them know if they don't know me that they can ask me to put $500 or $1,000 into an escrow account, and we have what do you call them, benchmarks that when you give me the first draft you get 35%, when you give me the final draft you get another, and when it goes to print you get this, and then I aggregate all of those things in a platform that I serve ads to, and you get a percentage of the ads. I mean, I think it's what you're really talking about is you want to compensate people for their work and make it possible for them to get work and for it to be global. So what I'm doing right now is I just sent a letter off to Western Union, where my father used to work. They're a big money transfer company. And today I finalized a draft to Swiss Telecom, because I think the EU is about to throw the United States out of reciprocity because of their safe harbor laws, right? It's like the joke in this country's national security requirements put everybody else's on a different plane. So I think that looking at something like that.
In Occupy, we had a thing that was like, oh, we gotta wrap it up a little.
Okay, so here it is. So
Is there a question?
all right.
Is there a question?
The question is, would a system that delivers on all those things and let people collaborate and be sort of, the internet is the thing, right? I have whoso.com. I have .whoso, the top level domain. I want to make it into a .brand, so it's not open to the general public. Do you see a way that something that does that with aggregating effort and putting it out and making people be able to work through it on a large scale could answer some of these problems, other than the difficulties you're trying to talk? You're talking about specific instances. Is there a positive side?
It sounds really interesting what you're saying. The problem is, sometimes you see it a lot at conferences. There's a lot of good ideas, but when you try to really think about how do you make that happen, are you going to pass a law? Are you going to how do you organize people on the internet? It's really, really hard. And so I really encourage people to think about, with your ideas, what can you actualize? I tend to be someone who wants to introduce a law somewhere and get something passed, but you have to be concrete in what you're proposing. And so I'm not quite sure how to do what you're saying. It's tough.
I've invested $500,000 already. I have the generic top-level domain .whoso, like .nyc, whatever.
Cool. I think anyone who's interested can go to you after the panel.
Great. Okay.
Actually, it's about 4:06, and the reception is going to start at 6. So why don't we just continue this conversation where there might be food and drink? Does that sound good? And everyone's tired. So thank you so much.